I really appreciate you spending this time with me today, and looking forward to doing some more sessions like this. Right, and but today I really want to talk about the story in the 18th surah, right, about Moses, and tradition identifies his companion with this mysterious Al-Khidr or Al-Khidr, and want to be arguing that that story is echoing a rabbinic story, right? And this is well known in the literature, but I think I have something new to contribute to it. And I think our dialogue together also will offer a lot that's new to, to contribute to these types of studies. So as a preface of that, I point out really quickly here, so just an overview of some terms that not all of the listeners are going to be aware of. And this, first of all, is this term, the Mishnah, which is the body of early rabbinic traditions, right? And then supplements to that Mishnah are called the Tosefta. And the Talmud, probably everyone's will have heard of that. The Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah. And then the last technical term is the Gemara, which are rabbinic interpretations, right, of the Mishnah as well. But I want to start off with something I pointed out a couple of years ago in a conference that concentrated on the comparison of the Qur'an and the Bible, right, at the Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran. Of course, it was all done online. That was the age of COVID. But that was where I introduced my approach, right, to how I explain parallels between the Quran and the Bible. Right. So, right, everyone in the field knows, right, how the notorious days of Oriental studies, right, especially through the 1800s, where and early 1900s even, where Western scholars would use this language of borrowing. The Quran borrows, right, from the Bible, right. So it's sort of like a way to deny originality to the Quran, and so today, most people in the field will use terms like engage. So the Quran is engaging with, right, a passage from the Bible or some Jewish or Christian idea, right, or polytheist idea, depending on the passage. I used this term also engage with for a while, but I was really unsatisfied with it. So I came up with my own terminology that I think can be used equally by scholars, right, who have no faith investment in the Quran, and by even pious Muslims, and that is the divine echo. So what I mean by divine echo is if we look at the Mishnah of the Talmud, for instance, we will often see, and I'll give an example, we'll often see that God is portrayed as citing the Torah or some part of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, right? God is also portrayed as praying, right? And I'll be showing you one of the prayers that God is portrayed as praying, which is actually echoed in two places, right, in the Quran, interestingly. And so this is exactly what we find in the Quran, just on a phenomenological basis. Just right, look at the text just through the eyes of history. You're reading it as a piece of literature. You don't have to have faith in it or anything. What is this text doing? Well, it has God speaking. And oftentimes God is citing earlier revelations. Sometimes God cites these earlier revelations, and he gives the title of the particular book he's citing. And one instances of that is one I want to start off with here, and that is in the 21st surah of the Quran, and the verse or ayah 105. The reason I want to start off with this is because it's well known that this is what I call a divine echo, right, of Psalm 37, verse 29. And so if you look at in the left column there, right, so this is Psalm 37:29, the righteous shall inherit the earth, right? Tzadikim yerishu eretz. That's actually the first half of it. There's a second half, but the Quran is only echoing this first half. And you see there in the right column, Surah 21, Ayah 105, and surely we have prescribed, kitabana, so prescribed or ordained or even written in the Psalms or the Zabur, after the dhikr, which I would say means the message, referring to the Torah is usually understood, that my righteous servants shall inherit the earth. Now, you see that there's a slight difference here, right? In the Psalm verse, it said that the righteous shall inherit the land, the righteous. Here we have my righteous servants. So we have an extra word, and of course God is speaking, so he says my, but righteous servants. Now, I'm not aware of interpreters, especially here in the West, who have explained why this difference, right? Where does this word servants come in? Is it just something that's a general idea in the Quran that all of creation, all created entities are servants of God? Sure, but I think we can go further than that. And if we look at the left column in this table again, bring your attention to Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 11, where we have this phrase in the singular, my righteous servant. Right, now, and this is referring to the nation of Israel, so it's a collective singular. So it actually means my righteous servants, but right, so it's referring to Israel. However, the plural in Aramaic, right, righteous servants. Now, this we find throughout the Targums. The Targums are the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible. And so we find this phrase, righteous servants, or my righteous servants, in the Torah, for instance, in Deuteronomy 32. We find it in the Psalms, one time in the Psalms, and specifically in Psalm 135, verse 14, and many times in the book of Isaiah. All right, so now let's continue in that left-hand table, and now let's look at the full verse, full pasuk. Right, for Psalm 37, verse 29, the righteous shall inherit the land and dwell therein forever. All right, now there's a parallel to this, again, in the book of Isaiah. Now, which one is echoing the other? It's not necessary to establish that, but it will be very clear that we do have a parallel. So I will bring forth a seed out of Jacob and out of Judah, an inheritor of my mountains. Now, and the final two statements are the parallel to Psalm 37, verse 29. And my elect shall inherit it, and my servants shall dwell there. Right? So again, Psalm 37, 29, the righteous shall inherit the land and dwell therein forever. And again, Isaiah 65, verse 9, the conclusion, and my elect shall inherit it, and my servants shall dwell there. Well, that same verse in the Targum, specifically in the Targum Jonathan, renders this, and my elect shall inherit it, and my righteous servants shall dwell there. Right? So I believe that we, in the Quran, Surah 21, verse 105, where it's phrased, my righteous servant shall inherit the land or the earth, I believe we have an echo of Psalm 37, but also the Targum for Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 9. Now, and that's a lot more information than Western interpreters give for this Quranic ayah or verse, but there is more, right? And that is, if you go to the immediately preceding ayah, in Surah 21, ayah or verse 104. And that's in the right column. I have it listed there. The day we will fold, not the we, right? The sky like the folding of a scroll for writings. Right? Just as we began the first creation, we will repeat it. A promise binding on us, we will do it. Now, all right, so go to the left in the left column, right? And you'll see I've quoted the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 65, verse 17, for behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered, nor come to mind, right? That's the same basic concept that we have in the Ayah 104. But then I list there Isaiah 34:4, and the skies shall be rolled together as a scroll, right? Now, biblical scholars are going to know that Isaiah 34:4 was assimilated to Psalm 102, verses 26 and 27. Of old, you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They'll perish, but you will endure. Yes, all of them shall wax old like a garment, as a vesture, or like a garment, you shall change them, and they shall pass away. This is quoted famously in the New Testament, in the letter to the Hebrews. And this is quoted, you will roll them, right? Roll them like as a garment, right? Instead of you will change them. So you will roll them, right? Now, what's interesting is one does not roll garments, one folds garments. And in the Ayah 104, Surah 21, says the day we will fold, natuwi, the sky, like the folding of a scroll. Well, scrolls are not folded. And so many translations are going to translate this, the day we will roll the sky, like the rolling of a scroll. But that's really not what it's saying. It's saying we will fold the sky like the folding of a scroll. It does mean roll. But what's happening here in this verse? Again, we have a divine echo of this development in the scriptural tradition of Judaism into Christianity, right? Where Isaiah 34's roll, right, is applied to clothes, and so this has to be understood as folding, even though that's not what the verb actually means. Now, right, there's one more part to this, and that is now if we go to 2 Peter, right, 3:13, but according to his promise, we wait for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Now, what do we see similar in Surah 21, Ayah 104? The day we will fold the sky like the folding of a scroll for writings, just as we began the first creation, we will repeat it. This is a promise binding on us. So this language of promise, right? Now, the very next surah, Surah 22, verse 47, says something that also ties into 2 Peter 3, right? And they will ask you to hasten the punishment, and God will not break his promise. And indeed, a day with your Lord is as 1,000 years as you count. All right, so I show you all the parallels there in 2 Peter 3, right? So with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years. Then verse 9, the Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but the day of the Lord will come, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God. But according to his promise, we wait for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. All right, so what's the point of that first table that we've gone through? It is that the Quran, right, has these divine echoes, right, of the Hebrew Bible, including the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Targums, right, and the New Testament, especially with the New Testament itself, is quoting the so-called Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. All right. So before we move on, do you have anything to add or to ask, Aria?
Yeah, this is a very fascinating connection, and I like how you're talking about this as the divine echo, which shows that there is a continuous conversation happening across these different texts, and And of course, we know that these texts are separated geographically and in terms of time and space. And so you can see that there's a definite parallelism, and this echo that you're talking about shows that there's an interconnectivity between the conversations, and the subject is the same, the audience in a lot of ways is the same, and the message is sort of building on each other.
Mm-hmm. I believe that this kind of evidence I've compiled, right, this is an illustration of how detailed the Qur'an's knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is. So I don't think these are things that, for instance, a lot of Western scholars would say that Muhammad, the prophet, could have picked these things up in conversations, and maybe you heard homilies or something like this. But I think this shows detailed knowledge, right, of these texts, the Hebrew, also Aramaic texts.
So I suppose we can go two directions. I guess from a person of faith point of view, if the source is divine, then the connection makes a lot of sense. If we go from a historical point of view, then there's also this connection, and there's this linguistic connection, there's this thematic connection, there's a historical connection, and I think either way you go, the evidence is very strong in terms of this connection between the two texts. Not the two texts. It's more than two texts, actually.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So if one wants to go just looking at this historically, then right, the suspicion, not in a pejorative sense, but the deduction lies at hand that the prophet was familiar with the written texts, right? So how he accessed that familiarity is another question, but certainly it seems that he would have been familiar with the texts themselves, and not just with phrases that were thrown out in conversation, during business or during homily. So to me, it would seem that if we want to look at it just historically, well, we would have to think of someone who was immersed in these texts, right, for years, for years.
So we talked about this before, and you mentioned it at the beginning. It seems that the Quran is validating the divine origin of a lot of things that are not just in the Torah, but also in the Mishnah and the Gemara and these other texts. And I think that's something that a lot of people are not aware of. And I think for the most part, especially in the Muslim majority lands, if texts are found in the Mishnah or the Gemara or any of these commentaries, it's sort of immediately dismissed. But here, I think we're also talking about how the Quran itself is leveraging those texts and basically legitimizing their divine origin.
I agree. And another point to make would be what is the theological difficulty? There should be none, even from a traditional Muslim standpoint, because just as God cites, and he tells us he is citing David's Zabur or the Psalms, right? Just as we saw in Surah 21. So what if he cites the Mishnah, with or without telling us where he is citing from, right? So what would be the difference? I don't see what the difference would be. So if we have a divine echo of the Mishnah in the Quran, what's the difference between that and having a divine echo of the Zabur, right? Both of these are previous revelations, right? That God has given in various modes. So I don't see where the trouble would lie. But anyway, if we can move on to table 2, this is an example of exactly what you're talking about. And again, I want to use this specific example because it's well known. It's not something I discovered. It's very well known. And so in the 5th surah, right, verse 30, I've misnumbered it there. There's 31. It's actually verse 30. So he, that is Cain, persuaded himself to kill his brother, that's Abel, and he killed him and became one of the lost. And then you skip a verse and you get to verse 32. From that time, we therefore decreed for the tribe of Israel that if someone kills another person, unless it is in retaliation for someone else or for causing corruption in the earth, it is as if he had murdered all mankind. And if anyone gives life to another person, it is as if he had given life to all mankind. Well, if we look at the Mishnah in the Tractate Sanhedrin 4:5, right? This serves to teach that the loss of both his, that is Cain's brother's blood, and the blood of his brother's offspring are ascribed to Cain. So the same story of Abel and Cain and Cain's murder of Abel is being used to introduce this parallel now to ayah 32 of Surah 5. Therefore, Adam, the first man, was created alone to teach you that with regard to anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, that is, kills one Jew, the verse ascribes him blame as if he had destroyed an entire world, as Adam was one person from whom the population of an entire world came forth. And conversely, anyone who sustains one soul or saves one soul from among the Jewish people, the verse ascribes him credit as if he had saved an entire world. Right? And I've added another part of the Mishnah that follows there. Therefore, since all humanity descends from one person, each and every person, so just not Jews, right? But each and every human being is obligated to say, the world was created for me, as one person can be the source of all humanity and recognize the significance of his actions. So this section in the Mishnah, sure, is talking about murder among Jews. I mean, and that's only natural because this is, halakha and laws for Jews, right? So it's not telling non-Jews how to live, but Jews, right? But at the same time, it's certainly recognized that this principle, right, that if you kill one person, it's as if you kill the entire world, right? The seriousness of murder, right, is being underscored, right? So it's not some nationalistic attitude that we're seeing here in the Mishnah. And so in Surah 5, in the parallel there, we have a divine echo in ayah 32, well, 30 and 32 of this passage of the Mishnah. And you see that the same example, the same Torah example, the same story of Cain and Abel is used to introduce this parallel. So here we have a divine echo where God does not tell you the title of the work from which he is citing, right? So in contrast to what we saw at the beginning.
We've talked about the word in the Quran that's used to reference the Mishnah. And I believe it's methna.
That's right, there's a cognate, yes. Mm-hmm.
Is that coming up in this?
I don't have it written down, but if we want to find it, why not? Yeah, we talked about it recently, and again, I'm forgetting where it's coming from. It's that term is used twice in the Quran, and the first time it's used is in the 15th surah.
Yeah, we have. I think it was in Surah 39, verse 23.
Right. Well, I know it's Surah 39.
And it says, "Nazzala ahsana hadith kitaban mutashabaha mathna."
Yes.
If you could talk about the etymology of that word a little bit,
Yeah, well, it's one of the rarer places, right, where even the word hadith is used here as sort of a synonym for the Quran, right? But then it says, if you coordinate that verse with Surah 3, Ayah 7, where it talks about the Kitab, and the Kitab possessing two different types of ayat, and we can paraphrase and say that the one type are plain or exoteric, right? And the other are ambiguous, or we could say esoteric. And here in Surah 39, what he's saying is that this Quran, this narration, hadith, that we have sent down is esoteric. That's the first thing to point out. Now, sometimes it's translated there as it's like self-referential. It compares, right? So in this book, we have many stories that are told several times and repeated, right? But I don't think that's what it's saying. It says we sent down this Quran, which is esoteric, right? And then repetition, exactly like the Mishnah. The Mishnah, the Hebrew Mishnah, the body of rabbinic traditions, right? It's called the Mishnah because you repeat things in order to learn them, right? And so often we scholars in the West will compare the Quran with the Bible, and that's fine, and that works, right? Nothing wrong with that. But I think it's also helpful to compare the Quran, as far as this genre goes, and as, how it presents itself, to compare it to the rabbinic Mishnah. And after all, it clearly is aware of traditions from the Mishnah. And so I believe that here we have a divine assertion, or let's say a divine comparison, right? So God is comparing this oral Quran, which is a narration and which is allegorical, right, with the Mishnah, right? Which would imply that the Quran also is for the sake of being learned. You repeat it and you learn.
And this further confirms the level of inspiration that the Mishnah has, because a lot of times you'll find in the Muslim world, or people who are just sort of amateurs of this topic, they might look at anything that's not Torah or not in the Quran as not having any kind of inspired valence, or not having any features of the divine echo, as you were referring to earlier.
That's also would be a Christian mindset as well, because the Christian would also think, well, yeah, the only things that could be inspired, in theory at least, would be the Bible, right? But you do have a difference, though, let's say with Roman Catholics in the West and Eastern Orthodox, because they have the concept of an oral tradition, right, which is authoritative, like the Bible, right? And so, of course, there's a lot of qualifications to be made about that. But in Judaism, we have to understand, we hear this word Torah, right? But right, we have the Torah, the 5 books of Moshe, the Chumash, but right, we also have what's called the oral Torah, right? And so that's an authoritative set, and so I think that kind of authority of the oral Torah or the rabbinic traditions, which are preserved in the Mishnah, right, has this divine authority behind it. And I think that's what the 5th surah, ayah 32, is really implying there, right? So we, therefore, God, right, is saying this, and then, right, we have a divine echo from Mishnah Sanhedrin, right? So, it's basically the same type of language that God uses when we have this divine echoes of the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament.
So obviously, anyone who's looking at this amazing parallelism would have to either come up with a historical argument of how, in the case of the Quran, Prophet Muhammad came in contact with these esoteric texts, Or
Yeah.
you have to acknowledge a supernatural transcendent source that already connects all of these texts together in order to reference this level of detail.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's I would say that's the job of the theologian, be that Muslim or let's say Christian, right, from whatever background. But that's the job of the theologian to argue on that level. For myself, I would say that if we want to examine this text, Quran, as a historically, right, from a scientific historical discipline, um, we could compare ourselves then to, let's say, a physicist, right? Now, a physicist has no competence to tell anyone whether or not there was a God behind the Big Bang, for instance. It doesn't matter what a physicist's opinion might be. It is not in their competence. They are not able to deny or affirm, right? Any kind of divine entity behind the Big Bang. They can only tell us how the universe functions, right? And what's going on after the Big Bang, or at least sometime after it, um, right? And so, right, a scholar cannot prove or disprove the divine inspiration of any text. That is not the scholar's job. That's not what his competence is. Now, I mean, if a scholar, let's say a physicist, let's say a physicist wants to learn theology and philosophy, then they could give their opinion, right, about whether or not a God may have been behind the Big Bang. Right, but then they would be speaking as a theologian or as a philosopher, especially like an analytical philosopher. They would not be speaking as a physicist anymore, right? And so, similarly, if we want to scientifically examine ancient religious texts, it's not the job of the academy to affirm or deny the divine origin. Right? They have to stick with the text on a historical level, and the theologian can sort those other types of questions out. But certainly, right, if we want to do this, just as historians, scientific scholars of ancient literature, we see there's an amazing detail and amazing knowledge, say of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Mishnah, and even though I won't be pointing it out now in this talk, but also of the Jewish liturgy. We have intimate knowledge of the echoes from the Jewish liturgy in the Qur'an as well, right? So it would seem to me that historically the only way to explain that, maybe not the only way, but maybe the most economic way, would be that the author of the Qur'an, and again, only a theologian, right, can pronounce upon the question of, well, is the author God, right? So the historian is just going to say, well, yes, let's just say it's the Prophet Muhammad. After all, he is the earthly mouthpiece, right, for this message. So that should be fine, even from a Muslim point of view, mutatis mutandis, right? Then it seems to me, right, that the Prophet was acquainted with these texts, I would say, for decades, right? And he grew up in a culture, right, where the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, and the rabbinic literature, and the Jewish liturgy, the Christian liturgy as well, where he had heard all of these things, and so then to me it makes sense that when we have these remarks in the Quran about monasteries, right, where monks are there and they're praying. Well, they're praying the Psalms. That's what they would do. That's what they still do today, right? And so it's as if Muhammad or the Prophet, right, had long visited these types uh, of of meetings, right, and divine services, and probably had conversations about them. And but this is pure speculation, right? So, but this is the line of interpretation or grasping or forming of hypotheses that one would have to undertake, right? If one just wants to approach all of this, from scientific with the scientific methodology. right? And the theologians can sort that out. And so I'm not claiming to speak here as a theologian, right? So all I can do is point out the evidence of the detailed, intimate knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, of Jewish traditions and Christian traditions, right, in the text of the Qur'an.
Mhm.
And if we want to move on to table 3, I'll give one more example of these divine echoes,
Okay.
where God does not, again, tell us, right, what he is echoing. The text, the name of the text is echoing. But here we have an echo, divine echo, of the Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Berachot, page 7a. Right, but let's look at the left column. And so this is the 6th surah. First in Ayah 12, he has ordained upon himself mercy. And this is repeated in slightly different wording in Ayah 54 in the same surah. Your Lord has ordained upon himself mercy. Now, later, right, we have this transmission of a hadith Qudsi, that is a divine saying of God, right, in Islam. When God ordained or wrote creation, right, he pledged prescribing or writing to himself in his book that is deposited with him, my mercy prevails over my wrath or my anger. Right? So in Berachot 7a, the citation I give there, I need to give some background to it. The passage in Berachot there is discussing, giving examples of prayers that God prays. Because on the basis of certain texts in the Tanakh, the rabbis determined that God indeed does pray. So, and incidentally, the Quran has the same thing. I forget the reference, but it is said that God and the angels pray, right?
Yes.
Yes,
That's in,
to the yes,
yeah,
please go ahead.
that's in Surah 33.
33, right? Pray upon the prophet, right? So this is a prayer, right, of God and the angels. But here we have, all right, so God says, or God prays, may it be my will that my mercy will overcome my anger or my wrath towards Israel for the transgressions, and may my mercy prevail over my other attributes through which Israel is punished. And may I conduct myself toward my children Israel with the attribute of mercy, and may I enter before them beyond, right, the letter of the law. So this is another example of a citation here from the Babylonian Talmud, right? But without God telling us the name of the text from which he is citing, right? And of course, it's a slightly different example because the echo in the Quran itself is only partial, but it becomes more full in the later Hadith Qudsi. We have a fuller divine echo of Berachot in this Hadith Qudsi. So that's sort of the introduction. I know it's a long introduction, but I think it's important, right, to introduce this concept of the divine echo, either with God telling us the name of the text from which he's citing or which he's echoing, or not telling us that it is a divine echo. And in either case, what's the problem? If he can quote from the Psalms, he can quote from Berachot or Sanhedrin, the Mishnah or the Bavli. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what I see in this divine echo between the two texts is there is a expanding, or there's a recontextualization of the fundamental idea, and we saw that in the commentary in the previous example, where it's not just exclusive to Israel or the Jewish people, that if you kill one person in humanity, it's as if you kill them all. And in this case, you also see the same type of scaling, that even though the covenant is made with Israel, this Israel is sort of moving towards a greater Israel, meaning in the true meaning, meaning the servants of God, those who are
yes, I would say yes, that the Quran does often make universal the Jewish particular. What is particular in a Jewish text sometimes is universalized by the Quran, but not always. And for instance, in Surah 5, where we have that divine echo of Mishnah Sanhedrin, right? So the Mishnah says anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, right, it's as if he destroyed the entire world. Well, the Quran, Surah 5, verse 32, notice it's not necessarily universalizing it.
right.
It says, from that time, we therefore decreed for the tribe of Israel,
Right.
that if someone kills another person, right? And so sometimes we do have that kind of universalization, but often not, right? And of course, as in Christianity, right, there was this idea that that the followers of Jesus are now the true Israel, and this was a way to delegitimize, right, Israel and actual Jews, right? And so, right, this is something that theologians discuss and sometimes debate about whether or not we see this same type of supersessionist theology, right, in the Quran. But be that as it may, right, that's gotten us to the point where we want to be, and that's Surah 18, the famous surah about the cave, right under table 3 there. And this, right, so in verses or ayat 60 to 64, right, we have a story about Moses and his servant. It's a cooking servant because he has a fish, right? And they're going to the ends of the earth, right, in search of something. Verse 65 or ayat 65 is a transitional verse, as we'll see. But after verse 65, this transitional verse, or in verse 65 itself, and then comes this story, right, that appears in verses 66 through 82. And this is the story of Moses and an anonymous servant of God. A tradition identifies this anonymous servant, this enigmatic servant, with Al-Khidr or Al-Khidr, the green one, which in Judaism would be Elijah. And as this is Khidr is supposed to be like an immortal, and this is the same case with the prophet Elijah. He's immortal according to the Hebrew Bible. He didn't die. He ascended to heaven alive in a fiery chariot and made the transition, right, in that way. Now, the literature has long known that this story of Moses and Al-Khidr, right, is based on a story about Rabbi Joshua ben Levi and Elijah. Now, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi lived in the early 2nd century of the Common Era. He is one of the most important of the rabbinic authorities, right, in the rabbinic literature, right? But this story of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi and Elijah traveling together and having the same experiences that we read about in Surah 18, ayat 66 through 82, right, is preserved in an Arabic version, right, in a work called the Book of Comfort by Ibn Shaheen, right, and there's a Hebrew version known as Hebrew Yafeh, right? But anyway, this story was written down in a collection by Rabbi Nissim ben Yaqub, right? Who wrote it originally in Arabic, and then somehow there is a Hebrew version, right, that appears at some point. Now, this is a post-Quranic story as far as when it was written down, but this collection, known as the Book of Comfort, right, is a collection of rabbinic stories, right? And so most scholars, even today, believe that this rabbinic story, right, is what is being reworked, right, in this story in Surah 18, right? Now, Brannon M. Wheeler, has written a series of articles and even a chapter in a book arguing against that and saying that this Jewish story was actually, it's based on this Quranic story, right? I don't want to go into all the details, but I do want to point out a piece of, I think it's a vital piece of evidence that speaks in favor of this story of Moses and Al-Khidr being a reworking of this Jewish story about Rabbi Joshua ben Levi and his travels with Elijah. But before I get there, I'll point out that immediately after this story about Moses and Al-Khidr, in verses or ayat 83 through 101, we then famously have the story of Al-Qarnayn, right, or Alexander the Great, the one of two horns, right? Then, this is what has not previously been noticed, is ayah 109. It's the penultimate, second to the last ayah in Surah 18. And there was here in table 4, this is a very famous ayah. Say, if the sea were ink, for the words of my Lord, the sea would indeed give out before the words of my Lord would give out, even if we brought another sea like it, right, as an extension. Now, this has a parallel in Surah 31, verse or ayah 27. Even if all the trees on the earth were pens and the sea were ink and extending it or 7 seas after it, the words of God would still not give out. God is mighty wise. That's Drozha's translation, by the way. Now we'll go to the right column, right? So here I'm showing you that there is ascribed to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right, this saying, which is quoted by Rabbi Joshua ben Levi in the Yalkut Shimoni on Genesis 1:20, folio 7a. If all the sky were parchment, all the people scribes, and all the forest pens, it would not suffice to write down all the wisdom I've learned from my teachers, that is, wisdom of the Torah, of which I've been able to skim only that part which a hound can lap out of the whole ocean, right? And there's this is a development of a saying by his teacher. As I said, well, in Sofarim 16:8, right, we have another version of this same saying, again, by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. If all the heavens were sheets and all the trees quills and all the seas ink, they would not suffice for recording my wisdom, which I've acquired from my masters. And yet I have gained no more of the wisdom of the sages than a fly acquires, which dips in the great sea and deprives it of the tiniest drop. Then another parallel in Avodah Rabbi Natan. For if all the seas were ink and all the reeds were quills and every person was a scribe, they still could not write down everything I've read and taught. That is about the Torah. So they're not boasting here. They're emphasizing how infinite the wisdom and majesty of the Torah is. And we have another version of this from Rabbi Eliezer in the Shir HaShirim Rabbah, or the Song of Songs Rabbah. If all the seas were ink, all the reeds that grow in the swamps were quills, the heavens and the earth were scrolls, and all the people were scribes, they would not suffice to write the matters of Torah that I have learned from my teachers, and I called only the equivalent of one who dips the tip of his quill like a brush in the sea. And in the same passage, we then have the saying by Rabbi Joshua ben Levi. If all the seas were ink, the swamps were quills, the heavens and the earth were sheets of parchment, and all people were scribes, they would not suffice to write the matters of Torah that I have learned, and I called only the equivalent of one who dips the tip of his quill like a brush in the sea. Now let's go back to the left column on the previous page. And we're going to see something very interesting here, which I pointed out in that yellow highlighting in the left. Right. So in the Sahih al-Bukhari, is commentary on this story in Surah 18. Here we have an echo, right, of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi saying that this Surah 18, Ayah 109 echoes or reworks. Al-Khidr said, O Musa, that Moses, my knowledge and your knowledge have not decreased Allah's knowledge except like the amount of water taken by this sparrow from the sea with its beak. Right. So now instead of using the image of the hound and some of these others, now we have just a different image, but the same point. Right. And so we actually have an element of this rabbinic saying that is echoed in Surah 18, Ayah 109, but an element that is not in that ayah, but turns up in the tafsir or in a hadith about this ayah, right? But which we do find in the actual rabbinic literature, right? And so basically, what has been overlooked previously is that this saying in, the story of Moses and Al-Khidr in Surah 18, right, which most scholars think is a reworking of a story about Rabbi Joshua ben Levi and Elijah, right, is then soon followed at the end of the same surah by an echo of a saying of the very same Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, right? And what's more, recognizing the connection between Ayah 109 and the earlier stories actually helps us to understand that earlier story in a better way, and we'll talk about that now.
This exchange in Surah 18 is obviously one of the most Gnostic and esoteric interactions in the Quran, and as we can see also in the
that's right,
in the commentary. The question is, and even psychologists like Carl Jung have talked about this interaction between well, what would be from the Quranic point of view, Moses and Al-Khidr. So the question that I know we've discussed this before, that does it really matter who these two characters are specifically?
I think, yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Yeah, because yeah, I mean, just you know, so we have, like, obviously all Muslims assume that the Moses referred to in this chapter is the Moses, you know, the classical Moses. But clearly, and there's lots of debates about who Khidr could be. I've seen people mention that Khidr is Alexander the Great, Khidr is Jeremiah, Khidr is Cyrus the Great. There's all these discussions. What I wanted to hear from you is, does it really matter who specifically these two are versus what the moral of the story is?
I think, of course, both matter, right? The moral of the story is important, but the moral of the story actually is slightly different depending on, you know, who these characters actually are. And I would have to point out, though, that there are actually many, many Muslims, right, who do not believe that this Musa is the same Musa that we read about everywhere else in the Quran. There are hadith and tafsir that argue that this Musa in Surah 18 is not the prophet Musa, right? The biblical prophet Musa. It's a different Musa, right? I think one of the reasons for that is maybe, in one level, is the maybe influence of some kind of lingering knowledge that this story is a reworking of a story that involved someone other than the prophet Musa, and also this story of Musa and this anonymous servant Al-Khidr is unlike anything else we see in the Quran when it comes to the prophet Musa, the biblical prophet Musa. Western scholars, Muslim scholars realize that it's just strikingly different, right? And but as I said, there are tafsir, there are canonical hadiths who actually deny that this is the biblical prophet Musa in this story, and it's someone else. And but the question is, why then, if this was originally Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, why change it to Moses? right? So, all right. So I want to show now. This is another terminology. All right, I've talked about the divine echo. This idea that a terminology I've developed. There's another terminology I've developed. It's called typological name substitution. Right. And so what does this mean? Well, I just have to give you some examples, right? So the third surah, right? Surah Imran, right, is a very good example of this, right? So Imran, that's the Quranic Arabic version for Amram, right? It's the name of the biblical Moses' father. Now, but in Surah 3, there's Imran is given as the name of the father of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? And now it's curious. This same surah in ayat 36 through 49 tells about how Jesus spoke in the cradle, right? And a lot of traditions that are echoing what's a text known as the Proto-Evangelium of Jacobi, right? So the proto-gospel of James, right? It's that's what's being echoed, and that Proto-Evangelium of James is where the early Christians. That's the earliest text that gives the names of the parents of the Virgin Mary, and her father's name in there is Joachim, and her mother is Anna. Now, those are not the actual names of the Virgin Mary's parents. No one knows what they were, but they're typological. Why? Because, for instance, in the Gospel of Luke, in the first chapter, you will find a song, a prophecy that the Virgin Mary sings. So again, it's called, usually called the Magnificat in Latin. But it's a song that the Virgin Mary sings, a prophetic song. And it itself echoes the Song of Hannah, right, from the Hebrew Bible. And so, right, there's already a connection in the Gospel of Luke hinting at this connection between Mary and the Song of Hannah. So in the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi, Anna becomes the name of the Virgin Mary's mother. And so since Hannah in the Hebrew Bible had a husband named Joachim, Joachim is the name for the father of Mary. So in actual fact, what's happening is that the Qur'an is giving the name Imran to Mary's father, right? Not because that's what it actually was in history. There's a theology and a typological reason for it. So it's functioning typologically, not historically, right? And the reason is that Moshe or Moses had a sister named Miriam in Arabic, right? And so elsewhere in the Quran, we hear the Virgin Mary being called the sister of Aaron, the brother of Moses. But the Quran clearly is not confusing the Virgin Mary with the sister of Moses. It's a typological a system here of networking, right? That we see, and so this substitution of Joachim, right, with Imran is typological. Imran is not the actual historical name of the Virgin Mary's father, and Joachim is not the name of the Virgin Mary's father historically. Those are all types, right? They're typological, right? They have some kind of theology at work, right? So they have to be understood symbolically, right? Not historically. Another example of this technique, right, is we can see it in Surah Baqarah, the second surah, Ayah 259, and I have it here set off in a paragraph, and I'm not going to read it, but you can the listeners can see it there. What's happening is this is telling the story. It doesn't tell you the name, right, of a person who slept for 100 years. And they didn't age. So it's miraculous. Like in Surah 18, the early part of Surah 18, the companions of the cave, they slept for hundreds of years, right? But anyway, we know that this is a story about a character we know of in the Hebrew Bible, Abimelech, who slept, according to tradition, for anywhere from 66 to 70 years. right? So what that means is he slept through the Babylonian exile. So when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, they were there in exile for 70 years approximately. And so for that entire period, Abimelech slept. It was like a mercy from God. He slept. Then after 100 years, this says he slept for 100 years, right? And so it's Abdullah Galadari, a really brilliant Quranic scholar, has pointed out what's going on here. If we look at the verse immediately before this ayah and the ayah immediately after it, we see that it's Abraham and God talking about resurrection, right? So that gives us the clue. What has happened is that the 100 years comes from the story of Abraham. Right? Because in the Torah, we learn that Abraham was 100 years old when he had his first son with his wife Sarah, and that is Isaac, Yitzhak. And so Paul, in his letter to the Romans, talks about Abraham and Sarah and says that it was as if they were dead because they were so old. There was no way they could have children, at least not naturally. So we see a divine echo here of the story of Abimelech and of the story of Abraham's miraculous conception at age or generating, and Sarah at age 100, and Sarah's miraculous conception of Yitzhak at age 90, right? And so the 70 years of sleeping by Abimelech is substituted with 100 years, right, of the age of Abraham. This is another example of this. Now here we don't have a name that's being substituted, but we do have a typological substitution, right? And it's substituting a person, Abimelech, right, for Abraham, and the number of years of Abimelech's sleep with the number of years of age of Abraham when he generated Yitzhak, became the father of Isaac. And so what that tells us is that this verse, when it's talking about the resurrection, it is not talking about the resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. It's talking about the resurrection of the dead in a symbolic sense of the national revival of Israel after the Babylonian exile. And of course, that's a point that Abdullah Galadari has pointed out. And so there's another substitution. I'll give you another one. The third example of is Idris. Right, so Idris in Surah 19, he's also mentioned in Surah 21, and right, so nearly all Islamic exegetes, they're right. They identify Idris as the biblical Enoch, right? But the name Idris is really just the Greek name for Esdras, right? And so what's happened? We see in Surah 21, right, it mentions Idris together with Alexander the Great, Al-Qarnayn, and Ismail. All right. Now, we're going to see, right, that we already mentioned, right, in Surah 18, in verses 60 through 65, there it's Dul-Khanin, it's Alexander the Great, who is deleted and substituted with Moses, right? And then it's in verses 66 to 82 in Surah 18 where Rabbi Joshua ben Levi is replaced with Moses. We'll skip the note there on Ismail, but one final note. So we have Idris, who's Enoch, but the name Enoch is substituted with the name of Ezra, Idris. Now, one final example is Surah 9, Ayah 30's Uzair, right? And most exegetes identify that with Ezra. And it says the Jews say Uzair is the son of God, and the Christians say the Messiah is the son of God. But everyone knows there's never been a Jew who ever considered Ezra to be the son of God, right? In any sense that's analogous, right, to the centrality of Jesus as the son of God among Christians, right? And that's exactly the sense that this Ayah 30 demands. The Jews say Uzair is the son of God, just like the Christians say the Messiah is the son of God, right? So it's not Ezra who is the son of God in the same way that Christians think of the Messiah being the son of God. It's Jacob under his second name, Israel, right? So in Hosea 11:1, when Israel was a child, then I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That is the nation of Israel, right? And I give there the prayer of Jacob, which is an early Jewish text from the Second Temple period. Jacob, who is Israel, is the highest of the angelic sons of God, right? So whether or not Uzair is some form of the name Ezra, right? Uzair intentionally replaces the patriarchal name Israel, right? And incidentally, Surah 9, Ayah 30's Uzair is translated as Israel in an early Greek translation of the Quran, but that's, we won't linger there. But what I've given you there are several examples of how the Quran likes to substitute a name with some other name based on some kind of similarity between the two, right? And that's exactly, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, would you say that this typological change has a semantic purpose? Because I think one of the things that is very clear to me is that this text is not supposed to be looked at historically,
or literally,
or literally, right? And so, what would you think? What would you say is the semantic purpose of this typological transformation?
Right, there are semantic purposes, and I'll get to that, but there's also an artistry involved here. Something like, in Judaism, the rabbis love to practice gematria. All right, so you figure out the numerical value of a certain word. Well, you find another word with the same numerical value, and you can substitute it, right? And so and it could be like a game of the learned in a certain way, right? You have to be very learned to pick up these clues, and I think that's something similar to what we're seeing here. Yeah, so you see Idris, who is Ezra. Well, we're really talking about Enoch, and we give you a clue we're talking about Enoch when we say Ezra or Idris, because it says we lifted up Idris to a high station. Well, that's the ascension of Enoch to heaven, right? And in the fourth book of Ezra, right, an early Jewish text, Ezra is actually given many traits of Enoch, including an ascent to heaven at the end of the book, right? And right, and as far as semantics, the meaning of it, we're also having to say there's some theology there, right? For instance, the Virgin Mary's father's name is Imran, right? That is the name of Moses' father. Why? Because it wants to then create a theological link between Mary and Moses, right? So it's not telling you that this is historical, that the Virgin Mary was the sister of Moses and that Moses and Mary had the same father. I mean, but by no stretch of the imagination is that what it's intending, right? There's a theology at work there, and incidentally, right, the Imran is really not even the subject of the surah that's named after him. The story that's told about is the story of Mary's mother, but it doesn't tell us her name in the Quran, and that's because it has to go out of its way not to, because the Quran doesn't use any woman's name except the name Maryam. That's the only woman's name ever said anywhere in the Quran, which shows you that there must be a theological reason for that. There must be something fundamentally important about Maryam in the Islamic revelation. And so she is the only woman who can be named. And even when you tell the story of her mother, you give only the father's name, even though the story of Imran is not in Surah 3. Right. It quotes what her mother says, not what her father says. So there's definitely theology there. I don't want to go into what that theology is. It's quite complicated. Well, it's not complicated, but it's an extensive topic, right? But I'll just point out that Surah 19, which is named after Maryam, has by many more times, more instances of the divine name Ar-Rahman than any other surah in the Quran. And so Rahman, right, is cognate with the Arabic word for womb, Rahim. And the story of Mary conceiving Jesus is the word of God from her womb is somehow being related theologically to this divine name Ar-Rahman. So that's where the mystery lies, and it's fundamentally important. And I think that's why every surah of the Quran, except one, of course, begins with the basmala, right? With this Bismillah Rahman Rahim. So with this divine name Rahman, right? Because there's sort of like a feminine emphasis in Islam rather than a masculine paternal emphasis, right? So that's why you have a heavenly mother in the Quran, the Al-Kitab. But you don't have a heavenly father, right? But anyway, yeah. So semantics certainly are involved. Now, all right. So to jump back to Surah 18, which can continue explaining or answering your question there, right? So we have Moses appears in Surah 18. And people can just listen to me talk here because I haven't written down the text of this story. So Aria, feel free to jump in at any time you want in telling this story, right? And that is, it starts at verse 60, ayah 60, and Musa has a cooking servant, and they want to go to the ends of the earth, right, in search of something, and they have a fish, right? And this fish falls into or gets into the water and swims off. And it says, miraculously, wondrously, right? And so this Musa, is a typological substitution. That is the story of Alexander the Great, right? And it's told in the story of Alexander the Great in this great poem by Jacob or Jacob of Serug, written in Syria about 100 years before the Quran. And there we read this story of Alexander the Great going to the ends of the earth with his cooking servant, and of course many others, right? But he has this cooking servant. They have a salted fish, and they've been told that at the ends of the earth they will find the fountain of life. So Alexander the Great tells his cooking servant, who in this poem is anonymous, his name is never given, so he's anonymous in the Quran as well. It says, look, we got to find that fountain of life, immortality. And so this old man tells them, well, there are a lot of fountains there. So Alexander tells his cooking servant, look, you got to wash the salted fish in every fountain that you can find. And when the fish comes alive, you'll know that's the fountain of life. So when you find it, tell me. But the cooking servant doesn't tell him. And this is why in the story in the Quran, it says that Satan, right, influenced the cooking servant not to tell Musa, right, of what happened, how the fish escaped, right? All right, so there you have Alexander the Great substitute with Moses as typological. Why? Because later in verse 83, we actually have the name of Alexander the Great, or his title, right? The Al-Qarnayn, the one of two horns. So that's what connects Musa, or Moses, and Alexander the Great. They both had two horns. The two horns of Alexander, you can see it on ancient coins. They're the symbols of royal power. And right in the Hebrew Bible, the word that is used for when Moses descended from Sinai, his face was glowing with the kabod, with the glory of God, and horns of light were coming from his face, it says. So he had these illuminated horns of light, these streaks of light. So that's why you can substitute Alexander the Great with the name Moses. But the Quran wants its more perceptive listeners to know, to recognize the substitution. Hey, we're substituting this one of two horns with Moses. And we give you a clue that we're doing that because a couple ayat later, we actually give the name of the Al-Qarnayn, right? The one of two horns, right? And so you're given a clue, right? And all right, so the verse 65 is this transition verse, right? And it's an enigmatic verse because after verse 65, the cooking servant disappears, and there's only Moses and now another servant, right? With whom Musa goes on these travels, right? But now we're getting another substitution. But you can see another reason why in the first part of the story with the fish and the fountain of life, that Alexander the Great has been substituted with Moses, because this Musa has a cooking servant, has a servant. Well, the biblical Moses, his servant, was Joshua ben Nun, which is Aramaic for fish. Joshua the fish, right? And so it's very, very learned, the puns and the plays, right, that are going on, unstated, right, because you're not told the name of the servant. But the original listeners of the Qur'an were expected to know that it was Joshua ben Nun, right? Joshua the son, Joshua the fish, right? So he becomes, instead of Andreas, the cooking servant of Alexander the Great, he becomes the anonymous servant of Musa. So now he can become Joshua the fish, the biblical successor of Moses, the biblical prophet Moses. And anyway, so if we realize all of this, we and then we recognize that Ayah 109, right? If all the seas were ink and etc., right, there would be no end to the words of Allah, right? If all the seas, right, were ink. Now we're supposed to connect that, right, to this story, which is really about Alexander the Great and the fish, the fountain of life. But famously, right, Musa and his cooking servant, they want to go to the ends of the earth, and they get to this place called the junction or the confluence between the two. It's usually translated two seas, and so many people wonder, well, what two seas are those, right? The Gulf, or these are not two seas that would have famous names. What is meant is, we interpret the Quran by the Quran, and elsewhere in the Quran we do have this phraseology of where the two seas, or the Bahraini, right? The two seas that meet. And it's always the fresh water and the salt water. Those are the two seas, right? And I think at this point we can, let's take a look at table 5 on page 8. Because what I'm going to point out here is that this conjunction or the confluence of these two seas, right? These two seas, we read about them in the Quran elsewhere, right? Surah 25, Ayah 53, Surah 27, Ayah 61, Surah 35, Ayah 12, and Surah 55, 19. So not too many places, but the most important parallels I have here in table 5. Right. Now we're going to see how this saying of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi in Surah 18, Ayah 109, helps us understand the story of Moses and Al-Khidr. And the parallel here is in the left column from Surah 31, verse 27, right? Even if all the trees on the earth were pens, and the sea were ink, and extending it were 7 seas after it, the words of God would still not give out. God is mighty wise. First of all, in Surah 18, right, after that story of Musa and the two seas, or the two waters, the Bahrain, the sea or the water is not mentioned again until Ayah 109, the parallel to this saying in Ayah 27 of Surah 31. So that means we're supposed to connect the seas of that ayah and of this ayah with the two waters or the two seas where Musa and his cooking servant meet, where you have the fountain of life. So what's going on is that the sea or the water is a symbol for the knowledge of the words of Allah, or in the saying of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, of the Torah, right? And so I would say the fresh waters and the salt waters are symbols of the esoteric and exoteric senses of the Torah or of the Quran. But anyway, notice here in Surah 31, then Ayah 29, do you not see that God causes the night to pass into the day and causes the day to pass into the night, and has subjected the sun and the moon, each one running its course for an appointed time? And you see there's a parallel to that in Surah 35, which I've color coded in Surah 35, verse Ayah 13. If you scroll down just a little bit, Aria, there you see it in the gray, verse 13. It's the same statement. He causes the night to pass into the day, causes the day to pass into the night. He has subjected the sun and the moon, each one running its course for an appointed time. All right, so back to Surah 31 in the left column. Right, so that is because God, he is the truth, and what they call on instead of him, you see that there's a parallel to that. Again, sorry, but scroll down on Surah 35, verse 13, the bottom of verse 13, you see I've underlined it, and those you call on instead of him, right? And now you can leave it there in Surah 31, verse 31, or Ayah 31, do you not see that the ship runs on the sea by the blessing of God? And so that's paralleled. Let's see, well, especially in Surah 55, so once you scroll up, well, you see verse 28 of Surah 55 in the extreme right column in the blue highlight, right? So which of the blessings of your Lord will you two call a lie? So favor, blessings is synonymous, really, right? And then in Surah 31, verse Ayah 34, surely God with him is the knowledge of the hour. He sends down the rain, and he knows what is in the wombs, but no person knows what he will earn tomorrow, and no person knows in what place on earth he will die. Surely God is knowing. So that has a parallel up at the top of the middle column in Surah 35. So scroll up in Ayah 11. They're in this sort of grayish, or I guess, highlighting. Right, so no female conceives or delivers except with his knowledge, and no one grows old or goes or is diminished in his life except it is in a book. And then the two seas are not alike. The one is sweet, fresh, good to drink. Anyway, in Surah 55, he let loose the two seas which meet. Pearl and coral come forth from both of them, right? And that's paralleled in Surah 35, verse 12, right, in that sort of purple highlighting. So the two seas are not alike. One is sweet, one fresh, good to drink, and this other one's salty and bitter. Yet from each you eat fresh fish and bring out of it an ornament which you wear. And then back to Surah 55, his are the ships. Anyway, so if you examine this table, you see how all of these you see a constellation of tropes, right? Which are all especially dealing with the two seas that are sweet and bitter, or the two waters is really what it's saying, because there's no fresh sea, right? So the point of this is that all of this fresh and salty waters, right, are symbols for the waters as the senses of interpretation, the meanings, the potential meanings of the words of God, right? So in the words of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, it would be the words of Torah, right? So, traditionally in Judaism, you have four senses, four ways you can interpret the Torah, right? So there's the literal, there's a homiletical, allegorical, but there's also then the esoteric sense, right?
Yeah.
Now the Quran sort of has, and that develops sort of around the time of Moshe de Leon, right, in the Middle Ages. But earlier than that, like the Jewish philosopher theologian Philo of Alexandria, he dealt with only two levels of interpretation of the Torah: the literal or the plain, and the allegorical, which would be the esoteric. And that's sort of what you have in the Quran. The two senses of the words of God, right, are the fresh water and the salt water, the esoteric and the exoteric. But Surah 31, there is, in that saying, it says 7 seas or 7 waters. So there it's as if, right, you could have 7 levels of interpretation, right? And of course, ultimately, there's an infinite number, right? Infinite number or levels. of interpretation, right? Because among the Shia, for Surah 18, for this story of Musa and Al-Khidr, right? Well, the story about Musa and his cooking servant, I should say, where they meet at the confluence of the two waters, right? So this is the confluence is understood to be Fatima, the daughter of the prophet, and the two waters, right, are Muhammad and Ali. Muhammad is the exoteric sense, and Ali is the esoteric sense, and so those two meet, or they are harmonized at the confluence, which is the daughter, Fatima, who has a title, right? One of her many titles, traditional titles, is she is the mother of her father, right? Quite profound, but that makes eminent sense if you're talking about levels of interpretation of Torah, right? Or of the Qur'an, right? And, but something deeper, I think, is going on here, because we go back to that verse 65, where the cooking servant of Moses disappears, and it seems to be replaced by another servant, whom tradition identifies as Al-Khidr. Now, the key to solving that enigma of why does the cooking servant disappear, it is, if you know the story of Alexander the Great, you know that the cooking servant jumped into the water of life when the fish swam away trying to get the fish, and became immortal. The cooking servant became immortal when he jumped in. So the new servant that appears in verse 65 and replaces the old servant is the same servant, just as a new spiritual entity, a new spiritual man, immortalized, right? So the cooking servant actually has become Elijah, the immortal prophet, right? And so, knowing the background stories actually does have an impact on what the moral of this story is, right? So I think it's very important. And I think that the Qur'an, and I say it's my scholarly opinion, that the Qur'an, or the author of the Qur'an, was expecting the original hearers of these stories to know this background and to make these connections and say, you're telling the story of Alexander the Great, but you're calling him Musa. Why? Well, then they get a clue. A couple ayat later, he starts talking about the one of two horns, that is Alexander the Great, right? So there are clues given. So this is just not fantasy, right? Trying to read things into these stories. We have clues in the text itself, right, that point us to, what names were substituted, and so what names we're supposed to resubstitute and put back in its place to understand the full significance of the story, right? So I think it does make a lot of sense, and to know the actual original names behind the story is very important, because there's an unfortunate trend in Islamic literature based on this story of Musa and Al-Khidr, and that is, we find it in a hadith, for instance, which, just to put it bluntly, is offensive to Jews. And that is, there's this story told that Moses, right, was boasting about his knowledge and said that no one knows more than I do. And then someone points out to him, that no, there's this guy, Al-Khidr, he knows more than you do, right? So here's this story. Well, this contradicts what the Torah itself says, right? And the Torah is something I think we should listen to from a Quranic perspective, because the Quran tells us to, right? And in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, chapter 12, verse 4, it is said that Moshe was the most humble man of all the earth, right? So this is in fact, in Judaism, this is the primary mark. The ethical virtue of Moses was his extreme humility. And so it is understood that this is why God favored Moshe, because of his humility, right? And so, but anyway, so this hadith saying that Moses was arrogant and thought he was a know-it-all, right, is then substantiated with this story of Moses and Al-Khidr, right? But that's that Musa in that story, right, has is a typological substitution, right? And the name that is behind it is Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, right? Who was always praying and fasting that the prophet Elijah would appear to him and teach him, right? And so, that happens, and they go on these journeys in this story, which is reworked in the Quran there. So these negative ideas about Musa, and it's all the more preposterous, right, for a hadith to talk about the arrogance of Moses when the Quran itself, in several places, when Musa comes before Pharaoh, the Quran says that Pharaoh was arrogant. Right, so it's just a lot of bad theology has been done, right, about Musa based on reading that story in Surah 18 historically instead of typologically, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have to understand that, to a certain extent, there's you can apply that story to Moses, but to a certain extent you cannot, right? And the extent that you can apply it there is because the whole thing is about the Torah, which comes from Moses, the Torah and the senses of interpretation, the sweet waters, the salt waters, the esoteric, the exoteric, which ultimately are infinite because, that verse 109 at the end of Surah 18 tells us basically that the words of God, the waters, the sea, the waters, right, the words of God are inexhaustible. You could exhaust all the waters, and you won't exhaust the words of God. That is, you can never stop interpreting the divine words. Right. Anyway, I hope I've been coherent, and I hope something of this is helpful for the audience.
Yeah, I think the symbolic nature of water being the prophetic message or divine communication, and the different layers of interpretation and meaning that one can attain to is very profound and significant. And I think that's generally how most would interpret the purpose of Surah 18 and the interaction of Al-Khidr and Moses. And you've mentioned a number of characters, Alexander the Great being one of them, Elijah being another, and it also this phenomena that we're calling typological substitution might also be understood in terms of spiritual development and spiritual reincarnation in different periods of time, and how knowledge is gained and increases through every spiritual vessel over time and across different contexts. And I think this is where the concept of rej'a, the return, and its connection to, for lack of, basically it is reincarnation. And I know that's a topic that's sort of a little bit sensitive for Muslims.
Yeah, but in it, I forget who said it, but it's a scholarly book on Jewish views of the afterlife. But the author pointed out that in Judaism, reincarnation is kosher as kosher pickles, right? I mean, it's taken for granted, in Kabbalah especially, right? And so, there is this idea that some of these great figures of religious history are just like reincarnations, right, of previous famous figures in history, right? And so, I mean, especially if they have the same name, right, one would be, a Kabbalist would be tempted to think that way, right? But, if we don't go all the way with that idea, we could certainly say it would be easily congruent with something like we see in Surah, the 18th Surah, where the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, has the same name as the sister of Moses, right?
Right. Well, definitely a literalist. The limitations of a literalist approach would lead to someone trying to fit this Moses of Surah 18 with the classical Moses, and a lot of times you enter into some epistemological quandaries, really, and I think you have to take this more esoteric perspective on these stories. Otherwise, you're sort of in you're trapped.
Yeah, and I think it's intentional. I think the Quran is doing something intentional there, right? So it's talking. It has this story about Musa and a cooking servant. Well, many people, the original listeners, would have known the story, I think, of Alexander the Great, its cooking servant. They would have gotten that. Then in the next story, though, Musa and Al-Khidr, Musa is like unlike Musa everywhere else in the Quran. Elsewhere in the Quran, everything's positive. And if there's a little bit of negativity, it turns out positive, right? It's never fully negative like that story is, right? And as graciously as we want to interpret the ending where Musa parts from the anonymous servant, it's like it looks really bad, through the whole story, all the travels. But so by putting the name Musa in that story, the Quran, I think, is intentionally, right, wanting the readers to get confused. So why? To think. And to think, okay, all right, so you just replaced Alexander the Great with Musa. Okay, now this Musa here, who is he replacing, right? And so this story of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi presumably would have been less well known, but it must have been in circulation, right? Otherwise, why retell it? Even changing the names, why retell it if there's no benefit for the audience who's listening, right? So I think the audience was expected there also to know, oh, this is confusing. This Moses has to be a substitute for someone. Oh yeah, that's Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, the servant. The companion of Elijah, the immortal prophet. Just like the cooking servant of Alexander the Great became immortal, right? And the fish. Oh yeah, Moses his servant was Joshua the fish, Ben Nun. Right. So I think the Quran is intentionally trying to confuse people, so it gets them to think. So it's a rhetorical strategy.
It also seems to parallel the story of the four rabbis and Rabbi Akiva, and how basically there's levels to knowledge, and at each stage, at each level, there's challenges. And you have to overcome those barriers.
Yeah, because they ascended to Pardes, to paradise, and Pardes later becomes the acronym for the four senses, the four levels of interpretation of Torah. So the idea among many scholars, and I think they're right, because I think you can find this in Philo implicitly, is that through interpreting the Torah, in other words, you would have they cultivated the ascent to the Merkava, visions to the throne of God. How were they doing it? They were praying and they were reading the Torah and trying to understand Torah, and this is what was generating these visions.
Right.
And so, yeah, the interpretation of the Torah is what Surah 18 and those stories we've been talking about is all about, and we know that now from the saying of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi that is reworked in Ayah 109, which gives us the clue to water being a symbol for the words of God, right? And so now there are these two main levels of the sweet and the bitter, the esoteric and the exoteric, right? Which is sort of an artificial binary, right? Which at some more primal level, they become one. They're right. So, and that's the level for the Shia, of course, that's the level of Fatima, and from which this binary of the esoteric and exoteric later originates. Right? Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We'll continue this great conversation another time.